Everyone, my name's Alice. Thank you. My name's Alice Tipping, and I lead work on a number of different trade and sustainable development issues at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the IISD. We have organised this webinar to present a couple of new pieces of research that we as IISD have undertaken with support from the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, looking specifically at particular policy questions at the nexus of trade policy and climate change issues, and looking at them very specifically from a developing country interest perspective. This is the first of two webinars that we're organising, one today and one happens on Tuesday next week. That's the 27th of July. And they look, both of them, very specifically at the implications of climate action and essentially of the massive transition that's underway from fossil fuels to renewable energy across different economies. It looks at the implications of that very large transition, particularly for developing countries. And these sessions, I'm actually quite excited by. Most of my time is spent worrying about the fisheries subsidies negotiations at the World Trade Organization. But this research, I think, is really quite interesting because it draws on many of the existing strengths that IISD has and brings in a trade policy perspective. So in a sense, these reports I find particularly interesting because they combine the engineering strengths of our staff and the economic analysis and also trade policy perspectives, I think, in quite a unique way. So today's session gives you a really very quick, high-level kind of thumbnail snapshot of two of the new reports, and next Tuesday we'll cover the next two reports. So the first report we're going to talk about today looks at the trade of raw materials that are used in electric vehicle batteries. This is something I didn't know about until we started work on this, and it highlights some of the key lessons from the extraction of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of the Congo and from the extraction of lithium in Chile, two of the most important producers and exporters of these respective materials. So, you know, thinking about the broad context of the shift that I was describing earlier from fossil fuels to renewable energies, and really drilling down into one very specific policy question, which is how can developing country governments, you know, who in many cases have reserves of extremely important minerals that are used in renewable energy generation, how can they best try and capture value from these resources as they have them, and use that revenue as best they can for broader sustainable development objectives. And that, of course, requires not only thinking about domestic policy, but also having a very good sense of where the market for these various minerals are. And that's, I think, where we bring in some very useful expertise in the development of electric vehicle batteries and the direction they're taking, and translate that into sort of thinking about the policy options for industrial policy that developing countries have. So that's the first report that'll be presented by Richard Bridle, and we'll have some very useful comments from Isabel Ramdu, from both sitting within IISD. The second report focuses also on clean energy, but is rather different. It looks specifically at how trade policy can be used to provide incentives to clean energy production in developing countries, and essentially helps, I think, governments to think through one of the most difficult and topical questions in industrial policy today, which is, when does it make sense to use trade policy to try and produce some of these components domestically, and when does it make sense, frankly, to import these components? So thinking about the market for these components and the market for renewable energy, what kind of insights can we bring to governments about how to make that very knotty problem, or how to resolve that very knotty problem in their own circumstance? So that's some of the perspectives we will bring to that. And that report is going to be presented by my colleague Christoph Bellman, and we'll have, again, very useful comments from Brendan Vickers from the Commonwealth Secretariat. And both Isabel and Brendan were kind enough to also give us their time as peer reviewers of their reports, so they know them very well. We're going to move through these two reports quite quickly, conscious that we've set only an hour for this webinar. Many of you will have WTO meetings you need to get to at 3. So we're going to move through the presentations and the comments from the discussants on each of the reports, and then I'll open the floor for questions and answers at the end. So again, our objective is essentially to give you all sort of key thumbnail snapshots of the key findings that you can then follow up when you read the reports themselves. And these reports are already available on IISD's website, and we'll be sending you links to them in the follow-up email after the session, so you don't have any trouble finding them. So with that very brief introduction, we might move straight into the presentation and discussion of the first report. So my colleague Richard Bridle, who's a senior policy advisor at ISD, will present it. And then we'll have Isabel Ramdu, who's the deputy director of the Intergovernmental Forum on Mining, Minerals and Sustainable Development, to provide some short remarks about the report. So that gives you also a brief introduction to the two individuals who speak next. So with that, Richard, I will stop sharing my screen to allow you to share yours.
Thank you, Alice. Just struggling to get my presentation up. Okay, so I hope that's in presentation mode coming up. So you can all see that. So I'm just going to move my camera actually. Right. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce to you our new report, which is called Driving Demand. It's got a long title, but it's about electric vehicles and trade in raw materials. So this work was designed to answer a number of questions. The first observation that we made is that there's a real climate-driven shift taking place, starting in a few countries, but that will eventually extend to all countries, on a shift from gasoline and diesel vehicles to electric vehicles. So observing that trend, we asked what does it mean for raw materials that the shift is happening? Clearly, there's going to be immense demand for batteries to power these vehicles. And what does it mean for the producers of these materials? How can they stand to benefit or face risks associated with this potential boom? And the next question that we wanted to answer was, what does it mean for trade policy? So how have governments already tried to take advantage of this trend, and what might they need to consider when they're developing their trade policy in future? So that's really what we're trying to cover in this paper. You can see in the image there, that's the cover of the report, and it's available on the ISD website from now. So before I start getting into the trade related issues and the case studies, I was going to give you a very high level overview of the EV boom. I don't think I really need to dwell on this because I'm sure you're all aware of the pace of change and the pace of increase in the amount of electric vehicles being deployed. You can see from that graph there, which comes from Bloomberg NEF, it's very much a exponential rise of electric vehicles, and particularly passenger vehicles, so cars, although buses, commercial EVs are all also growing at similar rates, and those rates vary depending which projections you look at, but everyone agrees that this is a very significant trend, and we're expecting electric vehicle adoption to move from a few percent to the majority over the next decade or so. So this is going to be a very profound change. So the question this raises is, how should developing country producers of minerals related to these cope with this trend? What should they do? In this presentation, I'm talking particularly about lithium and cobalt because these are two of the most significant minerals associated with this trend. But I just wanted to note as well that manganese and nickel are also used in some of the batteries that are used in electric vehicles. So there's other developing country producers, including Indonesia and South Africa, who are major players in those markets too. So while a lot of what we're talking about here relates to cobalt and lithium, it will be very relevant to other countries too. And also there's second tier producers of these minerals. There's more of them too, but for the purposes of this exercise, we focused on Chile for lithium, which is one of the biggest lithium producers and historically has been a very significant player in lithium, and also cobalt, which is by far the most significant country, the DRC, which is by far the most significant producer and exporter of cobalt. So the first slightly technical thing to talk about is just how different battery chemistries will affect the boom and bust, or the boom and boom or boom and bust that producers will experience. So this figure here just shows one projection, and there are many of these, about how battery chemistries might change. And what's significant about this is that Several of these chemistries include cobalt. So NMC and NCA both include cobalt. One of them includes manganese. Another one includes phosphate. So, but depending on which technology kind of comes out on top in this kind of ongoing battle between the technologies, it will change the shape of the demand curve for the underlying raw materials, and that's very uncertain. And this projection kind of sees a rising role for LFP. I just wanted to talk briefly about the factors that might decide that, and so scale matters a lot. So if a country that's very significant decides to invest a lot in capacity, that can bring down prices by economies of scale, and then those raw materials will go up. Commodity costs also matter a lot. If commodities become cheap because of production, but perhaps even because of trade prices, trade policies or other factors, other markets for commodities drying up, for example. If prices come down for a particular commodity, we might see a boom in batteries linked to that commodity. Politics also matter a very great deal as well. If governments decide to promote their industries and spend a lot of money doing so, then that can kind of change the balance of these things. The other thing is a kind of winner-take-all scenario where once a technology becomes dominant and the scale kind of increases, it's quite likely that we'll see just everyone adopting it because it becomes the default technology. Also, there's a kind of technological superiority force here as well, which sometimes technologies are just so compelling that it's impossible to use anything else. I also have a picture of a disc on this slide here, just to remind everyone that kind of very perfectly good technologies can kind of fall by the wayside, and it's never quite clear why. Just as there's a consumer shift, and eventually everyone kind of decides that a technology is no longer useful. The one other point I want to note from this is just that in 2018 there was an estimate that about 10% of the total EV production cost was raw materials. So where we're seeing kind of a boom in EVs that are produced for say 30 to 40,000 euros, we're talking about 3,000 or 4,000 euros worth of raw materials for those EVs. And that's obviously very rough, but it gives you an indication that that's a very significant amount of raw material production per car sold, and we're talking about millions of those. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm just going to very quickly talk about the situation and the context of the trade issues in Chile, which is a major producer of lithium. So it has about half of proven global reserves. Historically, Chile has been a real kind of leader in the production of lithium, and it has a fundamentally different technology to some of the other major producers, notably Australia, in that its lithium salts are collected from salt lakes. They are evaporated using the sun in giant kind of shallow lagoons, and that process inherently kind of takes time because it's solar evaporation. It's not done using chemicals or using kind of energy inputs. Whereas in other places, lithium is extracted from minerals, from solid minerals in a kind of akin to ways that we think of more related to kind of other mining production. So that there are some kind of like real technological differences between production in Chile and elsewhere. So demand for lithium for batteries has been outstripping supply, and that's caused lots of investment in lithium production elsewhere. In Chile, the investment has been somewhat limited. And then the other thing to note about how Chile, so Chile currently exports to quite a wide range of countries. So it exports to Korea, the EU, Japan, the US, and China, amongst others. And none of those are particularly dominant. So it's not a kind of particularly centralized kind of, it's not very closely tied to one consumer. It's kind of got a broad base of export markets that it exports to. The Chilean government are very keen to move up the battery value chain. They've had kind of procurement processes to identify battery producers, and they've also negotiated with some of their lithium producing companies to sell a portion of their output at preferential prices. So there's some elements of price regulation, and they've also kind of looked at other measures to develop the battery industry in Chile. From the figure here, what you can see is that the more refined forms of lithium, so that's we've got a graph here with HS codes, which just shows at the moment Chile doesn't export any batteries or cells, so there's no battery production in Chile that's significant. And carbonates and lithium carbonates, which are kind of the more unrefined form the vast bulk of the exports. So Chile has ambitions to move up the value chain, and they're kind of working on how to deliver that via trade policy as one mechanism. And they recently awarded a contract to develop battery production to a Chilean company. So they're kind of interventionist, and they're kind of trying to I skipped a slide there, trying to move up the value chain, and it's still very much a work in progress. So a very different example is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, which is far more kind of effectively a monopoly in cobalt production. I haven't got the slide here, but it's a very high proportion, so 71% of total global production, and it has just over 50% of global reserves. And there's a kind of China DRC tie-up. China is the major importer of cobalt, and also many of the kind of refining and mining companies in DRC are Chinese. So DRC has very kind of pointedly tried to move up the value chain, which is a common theme. So you can see here that in 2015, nearly half of the exports were ores, and by 2018, this was less than a quarter. So that indicates that there has been some kind of pressure to at least avoid exporting unrefined products. Partly that's been done by the threat of export bans that have been kind of introduced, not fully introduced, and rescinded several times, but there's been signals sent to encourage local production. To talk about the DRC's industry, there's two kind of parallel industry structures. There's the large scale mining, which tends to be big companies, and there's artisanal mining as well. Large scale mining creates is by far the biggest source of production. Artisanal mining is still very important. It's also very blurred between the two, because sometimes the large scale mining will procure from artisanal mining as well. There's one particular concern that's often raised with cobalt in the DRC is around the ethical practices in artisanal mining, but also in the industry more generally, around kind of child labor and other kind of labor practices. So this has led to many large consumers of cobalt and of batteries to consider there being a reputational risk from sourcing their cobalt and their batteries from DRC. So currently there aren't many other options, but the things that have been done is companies have tried to procure directly with miners that they think have control over their supply chains. They've also tried to procure cobalt from other places, although, as we mentioned, that given that the DRC is so important, it's very difficult to avoid them completely, at least for the big suppliers. But it's created a kind of pressure that, and the third thing they've done is they've considered using non-cobalt related batteries just to avoid this kind of potential reputational risk. So that kind of creates a pressure and towards other technologies. So in order to kind of tackle this, the DRC is doing a number of things. So one of the things it's trying to do is to kind of recognizing that it's got this role as a major player in the market. It's trying to kind of use that, and both to regulate the markets to improve traceability and reduce reputational risk, It's also trying to control the price to some extent by becoming a single buyer for some of the artisanal mines. And it's also, as ever, kind of trying to move up the value chain. So that's a very brief overview, and I invite you to read the report for more detail. But just from these two case studies, plus some other literature review that we've done, there's a number of issues that kind of seem common to some of these contexts. So the first question is, will there be a bust if we're having a boom? And a kind of this high level analysis kind of indicates that for lithium currently we don't have an alternative that seems to be near to market. So will there be a bust in lithium? I'd guess probably not, but anything is possible. Technology changes very quickly. For cobalt, it's quite possible that at some point there might be a bust. For some of the other minerals, it's also possible. So that means that when countries are making decisions about the extent to which to move up the value chain, they have to consider the possibility that there might at some point be a bust, as technological change means that these investments are no longer needed. The second point I'd like to make is that there is a risk that unregulated or insufficiently regulated activities lead consumers to bypass technologies or avoid certain supply chains, or just try and further kind of manage and understand and deal directly, and that should affect their policies. The third thing is all about kind of how clearly every country wants to move up the value chain. They want investment and they want to capture as much of the value as they can. We've seen that local content requirements are used. 90% of resource-rich countries have local content requirements of one form or another. And that's despite the kind of strict conditions implied by trade agreements to limit their use. Export restrictions are kind of commonly used, and they can be controversial. They can include export bans, quotas, duties, and taxes, and regulated pricing as well. So clearly, if you're going to move up the value chain, the risk of a boom and bust is a real risk. If you manage to incentivize investment and then that investment becomes stranded assets, that is a real problem. And that means that countries involved in the EV boom have to understand the technological risk, and they have to take a view on how it's going to pan out. And there's definitely uncertainty there. So I think I'll stop there because I think I've used my 10 minutes. Pass back to Alice. And thanks for listening. And I'm happy to answer questions when they come up. So thanks everyone.
Super. Well, thank you very much indeed, Richard. I thought that was a really useful summary of what is already quite a lengthy report. I perhaps will pass immediately now to Isabel for a few thoughts. You're an expert in developing countries and the management of their policies around mining and minerals and the contribution to sustainable development. So what would you add, and to that brief discussion from your perspective?
Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks, Richard, for the introduction and for the opportunity, and good afternoon, everyone. This is a really timely topic, just because also, a couple of days ago, we heard the EU coming up with its own mechanism on trade that is certainly have an impact on this. But maybe let me just take a step back and make a few comments here, and then maybe jump on a few of the issues that Richard raised in his presentation. The decarbonization of energy and transport to meet the global net zero ambitions by 2050 will require, as Richard was saying, an increasing amount of minerals such as lithium and cobalt. And as you rightly mentioned, this is not going to be an easy ride, and there are a lot of technical and geostrategic complexities around those minerals, which raise critical concerns regarding production concentration in a handful of countries and rapidly evolving battery technologies, which may affect the mix of minerals needed in the EVs over time. Richard was talking about the risk of boom and bust. For example, if you take lithium in itself, you've got different types of lithium combination with, for example, cobalt, it's carbonate, which we have now and which Chile is thinking of. But if you're looking at the nickel combination, then carbonate is probably not the one that you need. You need hydroxide, and that's not what Chile is producing now. So it's super complex. So I just want to make three brief comments here. First, it's a paradox with mining and climate change, which to some extent will have impact on trade. And as we know, electric cars are a significant contributor to climate protection, but mining processes have heavy environmental footprints. Lithium, we were talking about Chile, is found in the Atacama Desert, which is one of the driest places on Earth. And lithium mining is very water intensive, which will exacerbate the challenges that you find here. So the paradox is you're talking about decarbonization that will mitigate climate change on one hand, and on the other hand, you're exploiting the fragile environment for resources to power the electric revolution that will support climate change. It's a little bit counterintuitive, but that illustrates the fact that these will have really important implications for the global battery supply chain in the context of the entire thinking, not just from policymakers, but also from investors to rate mining companies on their environmental and social governance performance, because mining companies will have to invest in green processes if they want to access capital markets. Otherwise, they won't even get there. And we've seen recently, the biggest investor, BlackRock, recently made an announcement that it had blacklisted a number of mining companies for not respecting ESG. So this is a really important issue. It's not just the minerals, it's how you extract it and to what extent this is in line with the trend that we're talking about. I thought this was an important issue to raise. The other thing, the second issue I wanted to mention concerns the opportunity for developing countries to make the most of the wave of energy transition. And I think developing countries should not wait too long to leverage the current boom to move upstream, to develop their own clean energy production, because they will also have to meet the 2050 net zero. It may be a bit later on, but countries will have to go there. So it's not just a question of adding value to the minerals. It's also a question of the energy transition in the countries. And this is a good mix. And as it currently stands, the primary contribution of lithium and cobalt supply chains from developing countries is only through extraction of raw, and processing and manufacturing are clearly non-existent. And one thing, and Richard was mentioning this earlier, we've seen a trend that might prevent developing countries from even reaching that route. And this is this trend about securing access to raw material through the proliferation of offtake agreements, either because companies want to make sure that they secure access from responsibly mined companies or countries, or because this is a strategy, it's really strategic. So they kind of directly accessing mining, having deals with mining companies, and the smelting is not done in developing countries, it's done outside. And those deals very often are not very transparent, they are opaque, and they have very important implications for trade. They can distort the supply chain, create anti-competitive practices because firms are going to control strategic parts of the supply chain. And as you know, mineral products are very specific, they're geographically concentrated, and the supply market is limited. So if this is not regulated properly, the agreements will really harm trade and industry needs. And more importantly, developing countries have to, and we're seeing this, for example, next week, there is a conference in the Latin American region around lithium and around the global supply chain. And here the objective is to think through this as a regional asset, as something that can help build regional supply chains, battery supply chains at the regional level. And the LAC countries are probably going to be, that's the first time where the ministers will meet and come up with a decision. It is going to be about that. So you're not only, so it's about proximity, which is also good for the planet. You're not only developing industries and creating jobs, but you're also shortening the supply chain and cutting emissions linked to transportation, for example. And the other thing I was going to mention on that element, Chile is currently renegotiating its trade agreement with the EU, which dates back to 2002. And they've clearly signified the intention to include industrial activities linked to lithium in the New Deal. So it remains to be seen how this new generation of trade agreements is going to take place. And I think a lot of developing countries that have mineral resources and trade agreements with their major trading partners may want to think around that in their future deals. And my last question is more of a system. My last comment is more of a systemic question. I think the dynamics around mineral resources for low carbon economy is evolving in an uncertain regulatory environment. First, at the WTO, there is no specific agreement on raw materials. The general rules apply to imports and exports, and this leaves a lot of room for creative trade policy design, which can be good in a sense because it gives you a bit of flexibility, but it has clear limitations because it ignores the specificities of the mineral sector. And secondly, when GATT was designed in 1947, and even when WTO was established, climate and environmental concerns were not the priorities of the day. So it is not surprising that the current rules do not support climate considerations. So it leaves also a lot of room for countries to justify unilateral new trade measures, which have limited risk of being challenged because it's not very well covered. And one example is the recently announced European carbon border adjustment mechanism. That's going to be emulated by many others. Canada is already thinking about the same. The intent is a good one, but it will have ripple effects on imports from developing countries. And that can be misused for trade protectionism because, they come with very large package. Alice, I don't have to tell you this about, state aid to firms, consumers, looks very similar to subsidies. So I think if we want to really prevent that kind of unregulatory, both at the global level and at the national level, climate-related trade measures will really have to be weaved in better in the multilateral trading system. Otherwise, it will create discriminatory practices. We need to ensure that trade facilitates and not hold back climate ambitions.
No, super, Isabel. That's been all extremely useful. And I think particularly I wanted to pick up on the point you made about the challenge for developing countries, in addition to the boom or bust concerns and the question about how do you value add and on which minerals precisely, is this question that it's also a broader question about how you manage the energy transition for your own country. And one of the interesting little tiny points in this report that I thought was interesting is that when in some of the reporting around the DRC's attempt to impose export bans on some of its cobalt, one of the key limitations to the development of domestic refining of this cobalt was the absence of a very reliable source of energy for the industry itself, right? Which points to your question about kind of a regional approach, which would be interesting. But I thought I'd pick up on that point because it's a perfect introduction, in fact, to the discussion of the second report, which is all about developing countries' own transition from fossil fuel-based energy to renewable energy, and the question of how trade policy can help with that. So with that neat segue, I will give the floor now to my colleague Christoph Bellman, who was one of the co-authors of this report, very much focused on renewable energy components for wind and solar. And Christoph, I will stop sharing my screen now so that you can share yours.
Thank you, Alice. Do you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Thanks.
Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks, Alice. I will present this paper on which focuses on wind and solar. Maybe just by way of introduction or background. Of course, we've seen a significant growth in renewable energy in the electricity market in the last 2 decades, and now costs have reached a point where renewable energy seems to be competitive in almost all countries. And that, of course, has given, or governments have increasingly tried to maximize the local benefits that could arise from the production of renewable energy. We know that when you build a renewable energy project, that typically involves a range of different components. Some of them are highly specialized, sourced globally, but others can be sourced also domestically. And we've seen a number of countries now starting to look at whether they can promote actually the domestic production of some of those outputs. So that's pretty much the background. What we did is we started looking at wind and solar, and for each of those typical kind of projects, we look at the bill of materials for a typical project. So you'll see here the different types of components that are involved in the wind farm in this case. The HS codes for the products that are associated with those different components, their importance in terms of the total bill of materials, and their in the last column, we've tried to identify the extent to which those components are usually sourced globally in the international market, or whether they can be produced locally. So typically you see that wind turbines or solar modules tend to be sourced usually globally. They're highly specialized, but a number of other components, structure or towers, can increasingly be produced domestically. If we think also in the longer term, this looks at both wind and solar PVs in the short term and in the longer term, and the prospects for having, what types of components would be usually imported and which one could be localized. And we see that in the longer term, there's a trend towards having kind of more possibilities to get some of these components locally. So the question that we asked ourselves is, well, does the tariff structure of developing countries reflect this potential to produce some of the components locally while importing those that needs to be sourced internationally? Are there other factors that come into play? And of course, what are the implications for trade negotiations, be it at the regional or international level? So to do that, we've looked at a number of countries, looking at their existing tariff structure, but also trying to understand what their productive capacity is. We've used, in the absence of consistent data, we used exports as a proxy for productive capacity. So if a country exports, even if it's a net importer, the extent that you manage to export some of those components gives you a good indication that you already have some domestic productive capacity. So the first thing that we looked at is the top 30 low-income and middle-income exporters of wind and solar components. And we looked at their tariff structure to see if that reflected the fact that on the components that you would usually source internationally, whether they applied lower tariffs and while applying higher tariffs on those that could be produced domestically in order to protect them. And we see that by and large, the tariffs tend to be lower on those items, wind turbines, rotor blades, solar modules, inverters, that are usually sourced internationally, and slightly higher for those other components that are easier to produce domestically. But it's not that straightforward. And of course, there are a number of other kind of aspects that come into play, starting with what is your objective of your trade policy, and also what are your trade or your productive capacity. So to capture that, we looked at this kind of trade policy objective matrix, and basically try to come up with a typology of situations that we can find out there. So typically, countries that have existing production or productive capacity or export capacity and low tariff, it's probably because they're already competitive and they see this or these components as an export sector. If they have no production or limited domestic production and low tariff, it's probably because they need to import those components and they're import dependent in this area. If they have productive capacity but maintain high tariffs or medium tariffs, it's probably because they want to protect this domestic industry, or maybe like kind of infant industry. And another possible case is you don't really have productive capacity, but you still maintain tariffs, and in this case, it's probably for other purposes, and usually for using tariffs to generate income. So when we start looking at the use of tariffs, of course, those trade barriers can be justified maybe to protect local production of some components, particularly if they're suited to be produced locally. But of course, you always have to balance this against the risk that when you impose tariffs on components, you increase the project cost and may delay the kind of renewable energy deployment. So that balance of risk might be positive for some components that can be really easily produced domestically. It's mostly negative from those highly centralized components that are sourced internationally and where the entry barriers are really, really, really high. But in between, you have a lot of different situations. So to get a clearer sense, we started looking at a few countries and a few examples. I'm using here the case of Namibia to start with. Here, so you have wind, here wind components, and then solar components. On the top, you have the tariffs that are applied to those different components. So the dark blue is the applied tariffs. The white bars are the bound tariffs. So usually the applied tariffs are slightly lower than the bound rates. And on the bottom, you have the exports in those components, which we use as a proxy for productive capacity. So in this case, we see, for example, that Namibia maintains tariffs in wind on those components where it has some productive capacity, whereas on those where it don't really have a lot of productive capacity, they have their applied tariffs almost at zero. So that's probably a case where they're trying to protect some of their infant industry while at the same time allowing imports of components that they need to come in. But when we look at the case of solar, it's not exactly the same. Actually, they have removed most of the tariffs where they have export capacity, and they maintain them in goods that they would need to import. So that's not an exact a consistent approach, and there might be different explanations for that. We can come back to that. Another type of tariff structure is the case of Cambodia. It's the only LDCs which is a net exporter of solar components. So it's an interesting case. It has some interesting capacity particularly in inverters or in electrical components. But you see that by and large, it applies relatively high tariffs regardless of the productive capacity. So that might be a typical case where they're not trying to protect any particular domestic production. I think this probably points towards having tariffs for a tariff revenue collection. A third case, an interesting case, is the case of the Philippines, which is one of the few countries that is both a net exporter of solar and of wind components. Particularly on solar, they're quite active, and they have, particularly for solar modules, photosensitive semiconductors, and other electrical components. They have quite a lot of export and productive capacity. You see that they actually, in solar, don't really maintain tariffs on those components. So that probably indicates that they're quite competitive in the international market. But you see that on many other items which they don't really produce or export, they still maintain low tariffs. And these are really kind of nuisance tariff in a way, because they're not very high, they don't generate a lot of income, but they can be problematic. So that's another type of tariff structure. Now, to be fair, we're only looking here at applied tariffs, and we know that in many cases you have bilateral or regional trade agreements, and that these will have to be taken into account. So we've done that exercise just for the Philippines here, where we see, for example, for wind, we look at the main import sources of those components for the Philippines. So that's China, Japan, Singapore, and Korea. And you see that for those components where Philippines maintain some of these nuisance tariffs, most of them have been removed in the bilateral trade through regional trade agreements. But that's not really the case in solar. And that's mostly because the Philippines don't have trade agreements with the EU or the US. They trade on an MFN basis. They have one with Japan, which has removed some tariffs. And they have one with China, but they have maintained some tariffs, probably for some sensitive items in this area. So just to give you a few insights. So where does it take us in terms of what are the implications for international trade? Well, I think we have a number of initiatives which aim at liberalizing environmental goods and services. And I think from what precedes, one can imagine that developing countries' interest in participating in those initiatives will actually depend on, first, their productive capacity, their trade policy setting, their trade policy objectives, and to some extent also their export destination. So if you don't really have a lot of productive capacity, you would think that you have an interest in liberalizing imports because you need them. But of course, that's not a very strong case for international cooperation. Nothing prevents you from doing it on an autonomous basis. But you might still have an interest maybe to use trade agreements as a way to, trade off your protection in those goods against maybe market access in other goods where you have more of a export potential. If your tariffs are already low, of course, there's really little interest and incentives for you to participate in those negotiations. If you have strong productive capacity and low tariffs, that probably means that you're competitive in this area. So you clearly have an interest in engaging in those things. Depending on where you are, for example, the Philippines, they export a lot to the EU and the US. They probably have an interest in some kind of an international or plurilateral initiative. If you're like Cambodia, where 90% of your exports go to the APEC countries, maybe you want to focus that discussion in the regional context. And finally, the more difficult case is when you still maintain some kind of tariff to protect your domestic industry, whether you would have really an interest in participating in those negotiations. On the one hand, you can say, well, if you have some productive capacity, you might as well try to open new markets and remove protection that can increase efficiency. The risk, of course, is that you get outcompeted by imports. And from that perspective, it might be interesting to think as possibly the possibility of having list of sensitive products in those negotiations, where some countries could maintain some level of protections where they have strong domestic productive capacity, as a way to also increase the political and the economic case for participating in those negotiations. So this is a very quick overview of some of the analysis in the paper, and of course you're welcome to comment and thank you.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Christoph. I think that was a very good synopsis of what was quite a complicated paper. Brendan, you were kind enough to review this paper for us, and I know that your comments made it a lot better. What would you like to add to this discussion?
Thanks, Alice. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, we can.
Great. Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Let me just start by also thanking Christoph and Richard for the excellent paper. I think it addresses in very practical terms, and we saw that with the, particularly the decision-making tree at the end, really insightful how trade policy and trade agreements can support the transformation of this energy system. And I'd also just add that our Commonwealth members are all cooperating around a sustainable energy transition agenda. So these issues are really coming to the fore. So let me just pick maybe five issues related to the paper and outside of that, just to start the conversation. I think the first thing that really struck me when reading the paper is that what does this mean for a sustainable energy transition when there's such a wide variation in the local manufacturing capacities, the economic structures, and the comparative and competitive advantages across countries for these renewable energy parts and components. So I think what we see is the reality, is that most low-income countries and many lower middle-income countries don't have the capacity to break into these very specialized products that are technology intensive, high entry barriers. Production is concentrated, particularly in China and elsewhere, thinking around wind turbines and particularly solar cells and modules. But I think what the paper really strongly makes the point is that there are localization benefits elsewhere. So as we saw from that bill of materials perspective, if you're building a wind farm, there seems to be almost double the localization potential than a solar park, because there's more possibilities around, if you look at the tower, which can often be concrete, lattice, steel, the civil works, the electrical works, whereas solar parks require that global sourcing of solar cells and modules. So, I think I would agree that there's a pragmatism in adopting a kind of a modulated tariff policy that on the one hand, you ease access and reduce the costs of those critical inputs that can be competitively manufactured. And on the other hand, you can maintain tariffs where domestic industries can fabricate or assemble structured components while focusing also on the services side. As a footnote just to that, we've seen some countries using anti-dumping and countervailing duties to try prop up manufacturing industries in solar and wind, but with little success. And I think the US just comes to mind. These tariffs against China have really just deflected trade to other Asian countries and have had negative impacts for the entire solar industry. The other short point is that I think second, A related issue to consider is the extent to which various components, sub-assemblies, and systems are integrated as part of manufacturing global value chains in the sector. So this really adds another layer of complexity to these discussions on trade policy and industry development, for example, in terms of the ability of local suppliers to comply with technical standards. Third, the paper also raises local content policy and local content requirements. We know this is a huge challenge given WTO rules and even rules in RTA. So, these additional local benefits which countries strive for, the growth, the jobs, the political buy-in, the infant industry argument, also encounter the downside that this could make clean energy or these clean energy technologies more expensive than necessary and even end up undermining those environmental objectives. And I think the paper also recognizes that. So, from a trade policy perspective, the colleagues in Geneva, we know that these instruments often violate the national treatment provisions. They're prohibited under the TRIMS agreement. We're seeing a number of disputes at the WTO over local content requirements. So, there's really an urgency for us to think in the climate crisis, what can be done to ensure that these local content requirements are WTO consistent? And if you look at the literature, if you look at the debates, if you look at the proposals, these range from a temporary peace clause to avoid conflicts right through to clarifying some of the legal aspects of the WTO CSM agreement in the context of green energy subsidies. Just the last 2 points. Fourth, I think this is something that is really coming to fore in our post-pandemic world. The buzzwords of circularity and sustainability. Just something I raised with Christoph is that how can trade policy and trade agreements enable this, especially in a renewable energy world? We're seeing that there's also a downside to some of renewable energy projects in terms of environmental and waste management challenges, especially wind. Although most of the turbine parts can be recycled or used secondhand on other wind farms, there's also a growing problem with disposing of this blade material, which has negative impacts on communities and the environment. So this is increasingly a problem just being kicked down the road and raises the question of how trade policy supporting renewable energy can also promote more circular economy principles. Finally is the bigger geopolitical, geoeconomic question. As our energy systems transition from fossil fuels, introducing renewable energies into the mix is often touted as an advantage of helping to manage security of supply, insulating countries from external shocks. And in our world of technology leaders and takers, as we've seen with the current chip crisis, could technology become the new oil, providing the holders significant influence and leverage and impacting security of supply for importers of this technology? So the question for me here is whether energy security is or should be a driver for localizing the production of the component parts of solar and wind energy systems. And related to this, especially for colleagues in Geneva, is what role trade policy and trade rules can play to facilitate access, dissemination, and transfer of climate-friendly technologies. So I'll leave it to that. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Brendan. That was fascinating and 5 very interesting points delivered very quickly. So thank you for that. No, and a really interesting final point, I think, one that kind of puts the entire sort of micro question of trade policy with respect to these components in a much broader geopolitical setting, as you say. I can feel another policy brief coming on. We do have a few minutes left over for questions and particular comments that you might want to make on the presentations you've heard so far. So with that, I'll make sure that I will actually stop sharing my screen to make sure I can see the participants list properly. And if anyone would like to put your hand up to ask a question, I have the participants list here, and I'll make sure that even as an attendee, you're able to take the floor. So the floor is open if anyone has questions. I see one from Mahesh. I'll just wait, Mahesh, until in case anybody else would like to ask a question as well, and I'll take them together. Going once, going twice. If we don't have any other specific requests for the floor, Mahesh, I can have you take the floor directly if you wish. Go ahead, you should be able to unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Alice, and congratulations, Christoph, and also to all the panelists for the excellent interventions and presentation. My question was essentially, from the findings from Christoph's paper, what does this imply for negotiations to liberalize environmental goods and services in the future? especially the EGA, plurilateral or multilateral EGA? And does it also mean that there might be a case for special and differential treatment for some renewable energy components and for some countries? And of course, would this be sort of politically feasible as well, or would this just lead to sort of maybe a standoff in the talks? How would you sort of balance the need and the practicality and also the politics of the negotiations? Thanks.
Christoph, would you like to have a go at that?
Sure. Yes. No. Thank you, Mahesh. I think that's a very important question. What are the implications for countries? I mean, if anything, what the analysis shows is that there are lots of different cases and different situations, and depending on tariff structure, on productive capacity, on the trade structure, different countries will have different interests, and I think that's the first implication. So sometimes there is a tendency to think that all the developing countries are the same when it comes to those negotiations, and actually we see huge variations, including within LDCs and more advanced one. The second interesting thing with this paper is that when we start identifying those different components, that can be a contribution also to the future negotiations on environmental goods and services, and trying to go throughout if not the value chains, at least the different components, and identifying the HS codes. I think that's something that is interesting. And then some countries will be probably more interested in some of the components. Others might be more interested in liberalizing the ones that need to be sourced internationally. But to answer your question, I think in fact there might be a case, at least for flexibility in the way in which countries undertake commitments in those negotiations, particularly if the objective is to bring on board a wide range of countries, and whether it's through special and differential treatment, whether it's through different approaches like kind of a positive list approaches, or a request and offer, or something like that. But having some kind of a modulated approach is probably the main conclusion that one can draw from the analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Super. Thank you very much indeed, Christoph. And I think reading through the paper and thinking about the EGA discussions, I think I probably came to the same conclusion, right? That, at the end of the day, what this data and this kind of analysis really helps to do is to shed a very practical light on where countries' interests might lie, right? One that's based very much on kind of evidence of their current structure. And to that would be added, of course, a sense of their political constraints and what their government wants to achieve. But I think starting with the basic data and then adding the context to it is probably the right way to go. We're just about at time. I don't see any other burning requests for the floor. I'm just checking. I don't. So with that, I'm conscious other people will have meetings to get to that start just about now. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. This is the beginning of, I think, what will be quite an interesting work program within the IISD, specifically on the trade policy aspects of climate change. And one that draws on IISD's specific expertise and long history working on renewable energy transitions, and you've seen some of that in evidence today, and also on its long history and expertise in the political and the policy and the chemical realities of mining and its contribution to sustainable development. And I think you've seen that also in evidence today. So again, with sincere thanks to the UK's Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office for funding this work. I do also encourage you to join us on Tuesday next week, same time, 2 p.m. The registration link is in the same invitation email you'll have already seen, because Tuesday's discussion sort of looks at the broader policy agenda. It looks specifically at net zero and circular economy commitments in large markets, and thinks about what implications these will have for developing countries. And very interestingly, it starts to look at the interaction between climate change adaptation planning, which is something ISD has done a lot of work on, and trade policy, and how trade policy can be thought of specifically in a particular contribution to climate change adaptation planning. So that's next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Otherwise, thank you very much for joining us, and do have a good afternoon. Thank you very much.